Affirmative, we bring to you two extremely basic observations. The first one is that freedom of speech is good, and the second one is that fewer members of the Liberal Party is also good. Good for progressive outcomes, good for political outcomes, good for minorities, and good for climate policy. So, let's talk firstly about setup. The first thing that we would note to you is that this is not an actor motion, and so we should seriously devalue impacts to the individual politicians relative to the concerns that I've just brought to you around policy outcomes and around advocacy for good issues. So that, I think, is important to note here. The second thing to suggest is that this is about 5 to 10 members of the Liberal Party, so this isn't like a cataclysmic, like the party is over forever, but it will obviously have a very meaningful impact, both on the composition of that party in terms of the ratio of moderates to conservatives within it, and it will have a very meaningful impact in terms of the relative strength of the Liberal branch of the party versus the National branch of the party. Note that all Nationals members are against the voice. This is only about Liberals who are leaving. The second thing that it will have a strong impact on is just the ratio of moderates to conservatives generally within the party and the coalition, and that will impact the way that that body behaves. The second thing to talk about is that we think that when these people leave the party, it is most plausible that they probably align themselves broadly with the Teals. That is the group that their ideology is most similar to, like people who have the same conservative economic beliefs who also think that taxing the rich is bad and giving the rich tax breaks is good. But these are people who are similarly socially fairly liberal and similarly fairly enthusiastic about climate change. And when you look at the individual politicians that this motion is about, people like Bridget Archer, those are moderate liberals who do think that climate policy is good, do think that social policy is good as well. So it seems likely that they would sit with them. And not only are they ideologically aligned, but also obviously the Teal movement is funded by Climate 100, which means that they can get like a level of funding, a level of access to a brand. It just seems to make a lot of sense for them personally. The last thing that we would suggest is that this would be something that would be obviously quite controversial and would generate a really meaningful burst of media attention in the short term, which means that when these politicians leave, they would immediately get a large platform, they would likely be interviewed heavily, and it is highly likely that the media would want to give them that platform, see the enormous amount of platform that's been given to like literally just David Pocock as an individual. One, probably because he's handsome and he does well on the media because of that, but also because he's interesting and he's novel. Similarly, this is such an interesting and cool, good, like kind of media-friendly narrative of being like ideologically, you know, good and like sticking to your principles and that kind of thing. It's likely that these people get a significant platform. Let's talk firstly about why this damages the Liberal Party and why that is good. The first thing to say here is that obviously you just have like a decrease in the number of active Liberal MPs and senators in the House and in the Senate in the immediate term. And in particular, you lose almost all of your moderates who are left. Note that there are not that many moderates who are left in the Liberal Party right now. Many of them were just pushed out by Teals. But there are still some, like Bridget Archer. And what is important here to say is that we would suggest that with this policy, you lose almost all of those moderates, all of those people who are supportive of things like the Voice to Parliament, who are also often supportive of things like climate policy or other socially liberal policies. And what that means is that you actually end up really changing the composition of the Liberal Party and you make it significantly more conservative because you lose those moderate and those dissenting voices. You lose the incentive to be moderate because you no longer have people in moderate seats that you care about getting elected. Those people just don't exist at all. Instead, you just have a bunch of conservatives who have a toxic individual incentive where they want to get elected in their very conservative seat, which means that they push the national platform to stay conservative because that is appealing to their individual conservative bases. Something that is, funnily, very, very good individually for each remaining member of the Liberal Party who's in a conservative seat, but hurts the party's ability to actually form government. But obviously that kind of, works out in that way. So I think that what that means then is that it means that for the Liberals generally, it will become much harder for them to form government in future elections, and it means that you have more of a perception that the Liberal Party is a particularly conservative one, and that has impacts not only at the federal level but also at the state level. I would suggest to you the major reason why the Liberals lost power in New South Wales is because of their association with the newly more conservative, more toxic federal brand. Note the fact that the Liberals in New South Wales and Labour in New South Wales had like almost functionally identical platforms, which means that that branding impact actually does matter a lot. It means that it hurts the Liberals not just at the federal level but also at the state level and also to an extent at the local level, which means that this is a quite meaningful impact because ultimately in a Liberal Party where you do not have moderate voices, you are going to move more to the right, and that does have a significant impact on that brand and its power. It makes them less likely to be electable generally. That is an incredibly good thing. And obviously the people that profit here are more moderate voices, are Teal voices. You think that what this does is it frees up those politicians to advocate openly for things like better climate policy, better social liberal policy, better, advocate for the voice as well. And that is also important and meaningful in this debate. But what is really good about this is it means that at the end of this, to clear impacts. The first one is that in these seats, you give voters more choices. You have a meaningful independent that they already know, that already represents them, that has a party, not a party, that has a platform, and that has things like campaigning infrastructure and staffers to begin with. That is good because that can compete with whoever the Liberals then try to run in these seats, gives those voters more choice, gives them more access to representation, which is good for democracy. And it is good for policy because it is really, really hard for things like oil and gas producers or mining companies to buy off every single candidate, and very hard for them to buy off individual candidates in particular and independent candidates in particular, which means that these politicians are far more likely to be able to openly advocate for things like better climate policy or better socially liberal policy than they could have if they had remained attached to the Liberal Party brand, where if they had done that, they would likely be pre-selected out, or where they would get their funding cut because of the fact that so much of that liberal funding comes from those particular types of donors. Compare that to the sources of things like Climate 100 funding, which comes from people who care about the climate. This frees those people to actually advocate for things that they believe in openly, and then to pursue those policies in Parliament. And because the Australian Parliament typically does have a very tiny majority and often has coalition governments or minority governments, even a small group of people moving from the Liberal Party to the crossbench massively increases the power of that crossbench and its ability to do things like push for better climate policy, push for more socially liberal policy, which means that on our side, we clearly get into the medium and long term better policy for groups like refugees, better things for things like climate. That is, I think, the clearest and most obviously large impact in this debate. Compare that off to anything else, right? Getting better policy for refugees who are in concentration camps right now seems like a really big deal. Getting better policy for the climate, which is a genuine, humanitarian and ecological disaster, is incredibly important. Getting better policy against things like mining companies dumping illegally or destroying Indigenous sacred sites, incredibly important as well. So, let's then talk about advocacy generally and why it is so much better on our side. That translates into getting more of a likelihood of the voice actually getting up. First thing to say here is that when you leave the party, you can actually speak freely. You're no longer bound by the party line, and you're not bound by things like careerist incentives to toe that party line, by actual policy that makes you toe that party line, by the risk of getting pre-selected out or having your funding cut, whatever. But the second thing to say here is that you're incentivized to be more representative to your community, because now you can't rely on the brand or the infrastructure of your party. You must actually make the individuals in your party, or in your constituency, like you as an individual. And many of these politicians are already relatively pushed to the fringes of the Liberal Party, already relatively unsupported by it. They would likely do far better if they were just free of it, and if they did instead just focus on representing their communities and on severing themselves from that toxic liberal brand. That is extremely important, because it means that those people, when they then move to the crossbench, are more likely to be representative, which is good for democracy, but also are more likely to advocate for this good stuff. Compare that against what I think probably the only real negative argument is in this debate, what about change from within? First thing to say here is that when it comes to the voice, the party line is already set in stone. The Liberal Party has already done things like created infrastructure to campaign against the voice, solicited donations on the contingency that they will be used to fund an anti-voice campaign, and has already said very clearly at the leadership level that they will be opposing the voice. They are not going to backflip on that because Bridget Archer asked them to, and in particular, they're not going to do it because the moderate faction within the Liberals is completely disempowered, barely exists, is not in power, which means that that scope is non-existent. On our side, you can advocate openly for the voice. That advocacy resonates with these meaningful communities. It resonates in places like Queensland and in Tassie, where people know their individual politicians and trust them. That is incredibly meaningful. It makes it far more likely that you get the voice, but also far more likely that you get other, more important socially liberal policy as well. For those reasons, proud to affirm.
Panel, I think that the Affirmative team massively overestimates the will of Liberal voters to be critical of the politicians and of the party that they've been voting for the entirety of their life. Most people who vote Liberal do so because they generally agree with Liberal ideology. It's unclear why one politician leaving the party would cause them to massively change their worldview, to them themselves become more moderate, and just not to vote for the next Liberal politician who goes up for that seat, who is likely going to oppose the voice, why they would not just oppose the voice themselves. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, just 3 things. The first is rebuttal, and within that I'll kind of integrate some setup as to what this is likely to look like. Then we're going to talk about how the party is likely to change, and lastly as to how voters and voter preferences are likely to change. Firstly, let's talk about some rebuttal. I think 2 main points to look at here. The first is the consequences for the politicians who are leaving the party themselves, because a lot of the Affirmative case relies on this idea that they will then become teal independents, they will then get elected as teal independents, and then that will be super good because they'll just be more progressive in general. A few things to note here. The first is that it is unclear that I think they do just kind of assert that this is what is most likely the course of action. There are, of course, other courses of action, like, I guess, I don't know, changing party or dropping out entirely. Obviously, they are less likely, but I don't think it is true that they will just inherently become a teal independent in general. The next thing to note, though, is that even though they are, it's possible that they will become an independent, it is unlikely or unproven that they are likely to become this specific brand of independent. It's very possible that they are, conservative in other ways, and they just think that the voice is potentially something that is worth supporting. It's unclear that they're going to become this massively eco-friendly or eco-warrior in the way that the affirmative wants them to be. It's very possible that they'll just become an independent who is functionally liberal in every decision but this one. The next thing to note, though, is that they do just lose a lot of relevance and attention. Affirmative tells you that they get media attention because this is massive, but note, they suggest that there are 5 politicians who are likely to be doing this. That limits the extent to which people care about each individual perspective. But additionally, the media attention that they get is quite short-lived. It is just something that happens once and then we move on because this is a single issue that these people are diverging on. The media attention that they get is not likely to be massively important or significant to them in their career. The last thing to note is that you do just lose a degree of funding. The Liberal Party has a massive amount of funding that they are offering you as a politician. That is something that you lose when you go independent. So at the end of this, the way that this impacts the people who are likely to be leaving the party, unclear that they're going to be politically successful, unclear that they're going to be as progressive as the affirmative team want you to believe. The next thing to note, to look at in rebuttal then, is to look at the way that this changes policy and changes voters' opinions. As I flagged in my introduction, it's deeply unclear. Actually, no, I'll get onto this in my substantive. So, firstly then, how does the party itself change once these people who vote for the voice leave? The first thing to note is that yes, it is true that the Liberal Party have come out with a line in the sand saying that they are opposed to the voice to Parliament, but this was a decision that took them a very long time to make. It is a decision that a lot of people within the party maybe don't openly disagree with, but were sitting on the fence about for an incredibly long time. It's not something that has massive amounts of support within the party. It's something that they were quite hesitant to do. What this means is that when you say that the people who do support the voice should leave the party, it necessarily makes it hardline, whereas at the moment it is quite tentative. It is not something that is broadly supported within the party itself. So what happens to the party when these politicians leave? The first thing is that they get replaced. They may not get replaced in the seats that they occupy, but they get replaced in terms of the numbers in the party. The people that replace them are likely to be people who oppose the voice to Parliament, just because they see that if they agree with it, there is obviously not much of a career for them within the party. And they are likely, additionally, to be people who openly and aggressively oppose the voice to party, the voice to Parliament, as opposed to people who are fence sitters in that they have an incentive to climb up within the party. They want to, as openly as possible, support this perspective that the party seems to have, which means, so you have more people in the party who are conservative. Additionally, the people who are currently fence-sitting, who we tell you are much greater than the opposition wants to suggest, are forced to commit either way. Either because they see that now their perspective on the voice to Parliament shapes their capacity to be in the party in general. It shapes their, right to identify as a party member. But additionally, mentally, you're just more likely to be forced to commit when you see that people who have a specific perspective are asked to leave, which means that a lot of people who currently aren't saying anything are going to either become more conservative or themselves leave and make the party in general much more conservative as well. Therefore, you see the party get more conservative and more right-wing. Note that this is bad even if they don't get, even if the people who leave continue to maintain the seats they currently are elected in. So the party itself becoming smaller and more conservative, they point to as a benefit. Deeply unclear as to why a major party in Australia becoming more conservative is a good thing. Obviously, it is bad when you see this, when the policies that get discussed within Parliament become more conservative, when we hear more conservative opinions, when the Overton window gets pushed more rightwards. Obviously, that is a bad thing, even if the seats that they are elected in then become, or even if they remain in the seats that they are elected in. But no, there is no guarantee that they would remain in the seats that they are elected in. It's very possible that a safe seat who has been Liberal for many, many years sees somebody defect from the Liberal Party and then thinks that obviously this person doesn't represent what we value, and then just votes Liberal in the next election or in the by-election that's triggered. Obviously then, it's even worse because you have more conservative people who are being voted into the Liberal Party, you have more conservative people constituting the Liberal Party. that's bad in general. It's additionally bad when that party then continues to grow and in its conservative outreach. Obviously that's bad. That's bad for all of the social causes that they wanted to point to. So the party itself being more conservative is bad. It's bad for discourse, etc. Let's talk though about how this impacts Liberal voters, because this is a major harm. The first thing to note is what is the status quo in this situation? Firstly, the views, I think, of the Australian populace are largely centrist. There are lots of people who are politically engaged. I think there are lots of people who are kind of in the middle broadly and just vote based on, I guess, smaller issues or specific vibes. There is, additionally though, people who live in safe seats are likely to vote along the lines of those safe seats, even if they don't agree in totality with the party's perspective. They just vote in general because they've always voted Liberal. Additionally, I think that there are lots of other policies other than the voice to Parliament that dictate the ways that people vote, which means that in general, there is a strong degree of, I think, party allegiance within voter bases that exists outside of the individual actions of politicians. What this means is that when the Liberal Party has a particularly clear stance opposed to the voice to Parliament with no degree, oh my god, I forgot my setup, we would support them crossing the floor in our world. Like, it's totally fine if within the party they are still members of the party, but we are happy for them to cross the floor in terms of the actual vote for the voice of Parliament. We think that's a good thing, not only because it means that the actual policy for the voice is more like it gets through in our world. It's likely to be discussed and revised in a more healthy way in our world. Additionally, we just think that crossing the floor is a healthy precedent to set. So sorry, I should have said that way earlier. So, obviously though, in our world, you don't get that. You don't get people crossing the floor. You get a very hard line drawn in the sand, which means that people who are on the fence or people who generally vote Liberal but may otherwise have been open to discussion about the voice are unlikely to vote for it because now they think that to be a part of the Liberal Party, they have to vote in a particular way. Obviously, that's really bad if the voice faces any more opposition than it should. You don't get the benefits that they were talking about. But additionally, the way that this opposition is likely to manifest is likely to be racist, is likely to be anti-Indigenous. That is an incredibly bad thing, because that means that even if the voice itself does go through, the voters who are voting for that voice are likely to do so, or are likely to internalize worse values, more racist values. Obviously, that is a bad thing. Voting gets worse, the party gets worse. So proud to engage.
Let's make this super clear and use layman's terms. You are a USU debater who wants to go to Australs. The USU tells you that in order to go to Australs, you have to do every debate in clown makeup, what they're calling being clowned. You decide you don't want to wear the clown makeup because that's not what you believe in, and you believe you have your own autonomy and want to make your own decisions. Is it better that you A, do all of the debates with clown makeup and be clowned, or B, don't wear the clown makeup, choose to go with a different university and join the movement of anti-clowning, making it far, far more successful? I think that the latter is obviously a better solution for you. It is obviously a better solution for the anti-clown movement, and you ought vote for affirmative in this debate. Okay, three things in this speech. Firstly, benefits for the individual leading the party. Secondly, how this changes voting patterns, and thirdly, how this impacts the Liberal Party. Okay, great. So first, just super briefly on the benefits of the individual leading the party. And I'm just going to note the setup that we very briefly hear from Nicola, which is just that, we support them crossing the floor. I think this is really silly because, sure, maybe you support them crossing the floor. Unclear to me what that actually means, given it's a referendum, but also unclear because crossing the floor is really, really difficult for you as a politician. When your entire party tells you to vote in a way, it is very hard for you to break that, given that you are bound to their lines. Obviously, it is far more easy on our side for politicians to actually advocate for things they believe in when they're not bound to party lines and they're able to actually do things like vote for policies that they care about and make their own decisions. Obviously, that seems to be a good thing. Silly bit of setup, didn't really like it. But let's talk about the more important things in this debate. Firstly, on how this changes voting patterns. And we hear quite a few things from negative on this, mainly that people are still going to vote Liberal. I think this is really quite untrue for several reasons. Firstly, in terms of party allegiance, I think this dies anyway, because at the point at which the Liberal Party now becomes far more conservative, which we proved to you at Jordyn is likely to be true because you no longer have moderates in it advocating for moderate policy, it necessarily means the entire rhetoric and entire form of the Liberal Party shifts. So, whilst you may have in the past had an allegiance to the types of policies that Liberals supported, at the point at which those policies drastically change and become more right, you're likely to have far less allegiance. Also note here that people don't consider themselves Liberal voters just because they like the colour blue and they like the idea of Liberal. They consider themselves Liberal voters because they align themselves with Liberal policies and the things that the Liberals have believed in. Obviously, if they're changed, they're likely to rethink those sorts of decisions, which is why, too, it just means people are more likely to think about their actual voting patterns. It means that instead of just doing things like intuitively voting for the Liberals because it's what they've done in the past, at the point at which the moderates leave and the rhetoric of the party changes, obviously they're more likely to make more considered decisions about who they vote for, which means they're more likely to change their voting patterns. The third thing here is that people are already voting more independent, and we see that in the fact that the teal independents now exist, right? Obviously there is now a market for people wanting to vote more independent, especially with social policy and things like climate change. Obviously that is quite true in this debate. So I think that independent politicians are likely to be quite supported under our side of the house. The fourth thing to say here is that what do I have here? Sorry. Oh yeah, sorry. Fourth thing to say here is that the media attention over this sort of thing necessarily means it is quite a big deal and it's something that's going to be talked about in the press. That means the decision of these people to leave, even though Nate tells you that it will only be short-term media attention, obviously that media attention is quite a good thing. It means that people are necessarily going to have to rethink their actions, even implicitly, because it's going to be so broadcast within the media itself. That is quite important here. I think it's very silly for them to state their case on the fact that people are just continuously going to vote Liberal, when one, trends in society literally prove this to be just empirically false, but also two, obviously at the point at which the party changes, people are also going to change the way they're voters. And even if some voters continue to vote conservatively, and they keep voting for the Liberal Party, that doesn't actually matter because they're likely going to do that anyway, right? There is a specific group of voters that are important in this debate, and they are moderate voters. And they're the type of people who are likely to vote for their moderate Liberal because they like their moderate Liberal. Not because they like the Liberal Party as a whole, but because they agree with their one politician and they want them to represent them in their electorate, right? At the point at which they move, they obviously are going to still want to support that individual and might be more likely to do things like support the voice or vote for them as an independent when they run in the next election, right? But thirdly, and I think most importantly in this debate, how this changes the Liberal Party. Because we hear several things from the negative team here, and I don't think that they adequately interact with a lot of our material, particularly on why the Liberals not getting voted in the future is quite good. Because the important link that they miss in their case is, at the point at which the party becomes more conservative, it is far less likely to get voted in. So even though there are harms of the party becoming conservative, those harms actually don't matter because they are so conservative, they're not even going to get voted into Parliament, right? So those harms actually don't exist or aren't made to be that bad because they actually don't have a platform to practice these sorts of things. It's in the interest of the Liberal Party to become more conservative, but obviously in a world in which the Liberal Party does not get into power, that is far more better for us. First thing I tell you is that first thing I tell you here is that party becomes more right-wing, so now they're forced to do things like commit to these ideologies. This means they're going to become more conservative as a whole. I think this is true, but the problem with the negative case is they never tell you how these harms are actually going to become tangible and actually exist in society. They tell you there are really bad things about the Liberal Party being conservative. However, again, if the Liberal Party doesn't get voted in, because I think we give you quite comprehensive analysis as to why people are less likely to vote Liberal now, it doesn't matter if these harms exist. You ought to ignore a lot of that material until they prove that the Liberal Party will continue to be voted in, even though we prove the existence of the Liberals means that it's likely going to be quite untrue. But the next thing to say here is that the Liberal Party is already becoming more conservative, right? The very fact that the Liberals don't support the voice means existing moderates in the party don't have the power to change the rhetoric that the Liberal Party uses, right? The existing moderates weren't able to change their opinion on the voice. They weren't able to do things like lobby the party to get them to support it. They already have a limited capacity to enact change within the party, so it doesn't actually matter if they are there, right? Unclear why having a super large stray of politicians believing in lots of different things within one party is super beneficial if those politicians are continuously drowned out, which is literally proven in the fact that we are having this debate in the first place, right? But also, just it's true that they're becoming more conservative more generally, right? And so even if they don't leave the party, it means that these trends are likely still going to exist. So our harms obviously exist on both sides, right? That's quite important in this debate. But also, we tell you that it's really important for the Liberals not to get in, right? Because they do things like have really bad policy for people like minorities. They have really bad policy on the whole. They're more likely to vote conservatively. But the very fact that they form a coalition means they are likely to do things like support really terrible policy. We think that is quite bad. We'd much rather a world in which You get greater competition within the parties. What we think this looks like is not having a super clear-cut two-party system, right? It means people are likely to vote for the independents, to vote for the Labour Party, to vote for the Greens. It means they're more likely to do things like vote for smaller parties or vote for independents. So instead of having a really polarised two-party system, you now get better representation within the parliament. That is obviously quite important in this debate, right? Maybe it is bad that the Liberal Party doesn't exist. Maybe it means more people are forced to vote Labour. But at the point at which Labour has better policy and is more representative people as a whole, that you ought find that quite important in this debate, and you ought obviously vote for side Affirmative. But even if you don't believe any of that analysis, you just ought believe our side because we tell you this is better for the voice, and that is quite important. There is a unique capacity for politicians to leave the party at this point because the voice is something that many people support and they like and they want it to come and they want it to be voted in. You all care about the success of the voice overall. We are the only side that is able to actually do that for you. You ought vote side Affirmative.
I think Mia's clown analogy, whilst perhaps funny, is just not necessarily true, because in our world you were not forced to wear clown makeup because you obviously had the option to stand up against your party and to suggest that was wrong, and in fact that is something that we have seen occur currently. That is party members who have decided to say, we actually do support a voice to parliament and actually put in revised bills, actually provide more nuanced conversation around what a voice to parliament would look like. That has been happening recently. In our world you were not forced to wear clown makeup. You were able to stay at USU, you had more power there as opposed to going to somewhere like perhaps an unfortunate small 4 institution, and instead you were able to stay and actually kind of be able to create a far more nuanced conversation around something that was incredibly important, and that looked like a better conversation in Parliament. Because when you had a more nuanced perspective of how things were going ahead, when you had people who it did not necessarily mean you had to leave a party, but instead were able to provide a better examination of what was occurring, that was actually far better for political discussion, because what that signalled to voters was that you could stay and have other liberal beliefs whilst also still supporting a voice to Parliament. Because I don't think it's true that now everyone who watches is now I'm not going to vote Liberal next time because obviously they don't support a voice to Parliament. I think in fact a lot of people continue to vote Liberal if you already had, and I'm going to explain that in a second. But I think you stay supporting Liberal and it almost feels like you have no choice but to never support a voice to Parliament, because that obviously just was never the Liberal standpoint. When you have people in a party who suggest that there is a possibility to not agree with every single thing, I actually think that is far more important. It looks like examining your own and reflecting upon your own beliefs as you go, well, perhaps there is options. Even if I'm a self-prescribed liberal voter, it was actually easier for you to perhaps have far more examination of supporting a voice. And I think that's extremely important in this debate. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is basically just explain why you do not get a smaller Liberal Party, because I think a lot of their benefits hinge from that. The thing that they say here is basically, well, the Liberal number gets smaller and it's far harder, I guess, for them to get voted back in. But I think this is unlikely to happen, because I think let's actually be future focused and look like what this looks in the future. Because I actually think this has a significantly worse impact in the future for how this occurs. Because I think the Liberals who were voted in the last election were voted in seats that are probably never going to change. Because you had to be, to be voted in as a Liberal, you had to be voted in seats that were historically Liberal. Because as they literally tell you yourself, and they give you the mechanisms for this, the Liberal Party is currently weaker. That means that if you voted for the Liberal Party recently, you were an individual who was probably always going to vote for the Liberal Party, because it's not because the Liberal Party did seem more conservative in the past election. So these were seats that were always going to be conservative. These were seats that were extremely Liberal already. And I think the thing to say there is therefore the Liberals who now have become moderate are actually the Liberals who have left are not going to be voted in that seat in the next election, because the people who were in that area were already just extreme Liberal voters. That was literally, that was just genuinely the case, because otherwise those seats would have gone teal already. And I think currently, I don't think it's a tipping point for these voters about the idea of a voice to Parliament. These voters were specifically super happy for the Liberal, notably especially for example I guess in places like New South Wales as well. The Liberal Party was seen as being quite aligned with perhaps being quite conservative. So if you were voting them, you were extremely that was already conservative areas. Why is this particularly bad though? Because if it's true that you are just going to vote in a new Liberal person into these seats, this new Liberal person is going to be far more conservative. This is a person probably who is not, I'll get to you. This is a person who would be far more conservative in this seats, and that was actually far worse. I'm going to explain why it is that you get far worse political discussion as a result when you have significantly worse conservative individuals within government. But I think that is to say, therefore, at the next election, the more conservative person gets to power. Mia says, well, you're just are not going to support the more conservative Liberal, but I think that's untrue, because for most people in their everyday lives, especially in Liberal seats, things like the voice to Parliament was probably not the most important thing that you cared about, I think, anyway, and you were far more likely to align yourself with Liberal things on things like economic decisions that they had made, things about how, and especially because things like Teals and independence probably feel quite foreign to you as someone who was always just going to be because you don't necessarily know exactly what those party lines looks like. You probably have a far better understanding of what a liberal approach to politics look like. Those were things that you were always going to support. I don't think you wanted to support, especially when they're telling you, oh, this means all these people can have all these kind of more socially progressive ideals. I think therefore that perhaps that looks not more moderate and actually far more left-leaning, I suppose, as opposed to the people that you did want to vote in as a Liberal voter. That means that I think you always are going to choose the person who is aligned with the party. And notably, I don't think these people look specifically more conservative to you, because I think disagreeing with the voice of Parliament, obviously whilst is a conservative aspect, I don't think this person particularly looks far more ridiculously right-wing than anything you've ever seen before, even though it is likely that they are, because obviously people still brand themselves as just being your average Liberal guy, and if your average Liberal guy is going against the person who left the party and who you believe has negatively impacted the party that you cared about, you are obviously going to go for the person who therefore was your Liberal voter. So that this harm about the Liberal Party seeming more conservative and therefore getting less votes is just simply untrue, because people still know about personal branding. Obviously the Liberal Party is aware of how they come across. They are obviously not standing up and doing hate speech the entire time, but the person, those people who are going in necessarily, whilst being more conservative, are not going to come off as specifically far more conservative than your average Liberal person, and therefore they get in. I think that's incredibly important, because it removes all of their harms about having a smaller government. It removes any of their benefits of supporting a government, of having a smaller Liberal party in general. I'll just quickly note, apologies, that when we talk about supporting crossing the floor, that's obviously in regards to the bill that has to occur for the referendum to pass, as opposed to the referendum itself. That's what we cared about. It was obviously important to have the bill to be even able to pass, to be able to have the referendum in the second place. So then, why is it, why is it? Oh, I'm sorry, apologies. I'll also say that the people who leave is also the people who are prominent Liberal voters are also just still going to continue to get voted in, because these are individuals who are also still more conservative and who have historical safe backing in their seats. But I think that the point to note here is, why is this really bad, to have a more conservative Liberal party in a sense, in the first place? Because this is obviously what's going to happen. I think even if you believe that maybe you get some smaller numbers in the first place, why is it still particularly more pernicious to just even have a more conservative government, more conservative members, because the thing is maybe the quantity gets smaller, but the quality gets far worse in terms of how conservative these people are. And what I think that means is that Liberal voters who are looking at the people who they've just voted in who are conservative don't ever hear a nuance maybe disagreement with their voice to Parliament or anything like that. But I also think the second thing that happens is that if you were on the fence in the Liberal Party about whether or not to vote for or against the voice to Parliament, you definitely do not vote for it now, because you're gonna you have to leave the party, right? If you do, that's something that obviously if you see all the people who are supporting it are leaving, that means that you're well, no, okay, if I want to stay, I'm gonna have to support it. That means you get that is obviously far worse. That means you literally get never any opportunity for change within the Liberal Parliament as a whole. But I think secondly, voters who are looking at the Liberal Party see I think there becomes a lot more vitriol towards the voice to Parliament, right? Because if it's seen as completely diminishing if it's diminishing the power of the party with people leaving as a result of it, I think you get far more vitriol towards the voice to Parliament as a response. I think you actually get quite racist attitudes towards it going in, and I actually think that's far more worse, as opposed to just having moderate discussion within the Liberal Parliament about what that looks like. At the end of the day, it was actually important, no matter how small they were, the only way we're able to effectively get a far more moderate party in the future for the Liberal Party was to actually keep the moderate members who currently existed. Because the Liberal Party was not going anywhere, at least for a fair amount of time. It was therefore important to have them at least remain markedly more moderate. Thank you.
Negative's case is contingent on believing that if the Liberal Party becomes increasingly conservative, which both teams agree is likely if this were to happen, they will remain equally as powerful. And the reason they give us to believe that is because last election, supposedly the only Liberals that were left standing were the ones that were the most conservative because everyone else flocked to Teals. That is just not true, because last election was the first time we ever had the opportunity to vote for Teals. It was the start of a revolution, not the end of it. So what that means is that people are becoming increasingly more progressive and are increasingly more willing to vote moderate. And that's because they realise the climate is an issue that has a timestamp date. That's because they realise they should be more sympathetic to people who are transgender, and it's because things like social media are making them increasingly cognizant of the impacts of being tight on borders. All of that means that people are willing and able to vote more moderate, and last election was proof of that. It was not the end of it, it was the start of it. A Liberal Party that is increasingly more conservative is one that isolates its base, who are not its most radical and who are not its most conservative. It allows people who are moderate to flock away from them because it forces them to. We are the only team that is able to explain to you that a more conservative Liberal Party is a more unpopular Liberal Party, and ultimately means that opportunities for the Labor Party and opportunities for independence are much more readily available. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on the impact on the Liberal Party, and secondly, on voter allegiance. Firstly, on the impact on the Liberal Party, I'm going to respond to 4 claims. The first is on the level of conservatism within the Liberal Party. The second is on the ability for Liberal Party members to have nuance. The third is on people on the fence. And the final thing is on the ability to replace these party members. Firstly, let's make some observations around their claims around conservatism. Because we tell you at Jordyn that an increasingly conservative Liberal Party is good for the reasons I point out in my introduction. And Negative's response is that, well, it's actually really bad if the Liberal Party becomes more conservative because it locks people out and it means that they are never able to achieve change in terms of any other social policies, and it means that people become increasingly right-wing because that's the only option that is given to them because they're so aligned to that party. I'm going to explain to you 4 reasons why I think a conservative Liberal Party is a good thing on the whole. Firstly, when you have less moderate politicians, it means it is much harder to form a government, because now the kind of policies that you have to put your platform on are only lenient towards the people who are on the absolute right. And that means that if you are not on the absolute right, or maybe if you are still, or you're in the middle, it means that you have no choice but to flock to independence and to flock to Labor. And that's because, unlike the US system, you cannot simply opt out of the voting process. And so that means that your only options are vote Liberal and vote in a radically conservative way that you no longer agree with as a moderate, or switch to another party, and we're telling you that those options are likely to be independence and Labor. Second of all though, this means that the Liberal Party is deemed far more divisive. And that means it's much less likely, for example, to garner sympathy from news and media outlets that sit in the middle. So maybe they still get support from places like Sky News, but they certainly don't get support from places that are more in the middle or even a little bit conservative. And that's because now they have to push things like being tight on borders, they have to push things like hard nationalism, and they have to push things like being tough on crime. And that's because they now have no choice but to appease their most conservative voters, because they are now the only ones that will ever be sympathetic to them, because they've lost everyone in the middle. When you lock out moderates, and that is what you do through this policy, it automatically means you're more conservative, and that is a huge win for us overall because it forces people to vote differently. I'm going to explain in my second issue why people have incentives to do that. Second of all, let's talk about Millie's push, which is that now we allow for nuance within the party. And I think this is a slightly bizarre claim, but I'm going to respond to it nevertheless. I think it's unclear as to why a nuanced Liberal Party is actually a good thing. But even if we believe it is a good thing, 3 reasons why it would not actually happen. Firstly, the benefits of that nuance would be drowned out. That's because the incentives of other Liberal politicians to listen to the most moderate and the most left-wing of their of their party members is incredibly unclear. Second of all, these people can be more nuanced and express themselves in far more productive ways in another party. It is far easier for them to push through that change if they so care about it, if they are, for example, a Teal independent, or if they join the Labor Party. But thirdly, if you are someone who is pro-voice, that likely also means that you're pro things like the environment, you're pro things like refugees. So that means that your ability to campaign within the Liberal Party is relatively small. You are stuck in an incredibly hard place. You are in the minority within your own party, and even if some nuance is generated, it is just unbelievably unclear to me what the benefit of this nuance is. Like, clearly the Liberal Party has a relatively fixed stance on most social issues, so I'm not quite sure how to conceptualise the benefits of that nuance, even if it were to exist.
Thirdly, let's talk about people who are on the fence in the Liberal Party who now have to commit. Unsure what this means because people have already had to commit, like it's now clear what the Liberal stance is and what every politician's stance is, they've had to make that clear. But second of all, that's probably a good thing. If everyone now does have to finally commit, which is a fallacy, they already have, but even if they haven't, this is a good thing because it means that more people will walk, which is a benefit we've proven to you. Finally, let's talk about the ability for them to be replaced, because I think the first thing to point out here is that you cannot replace them like this. You obviously need to elect them in an election, which takes time and money. But second of all, as Millie points out brilliantly, they'll be replaced with the more conservative people. Whoop fucking whoop. That just means that it's hard for the Liberal Party to get elected next time. It means they're automatically putting in someone who is likely more unpopular with moderates, and that is a benefit that we can claim on side Affirmative. But finally, even if you replace them with someone that is just as moderate as the old person who they're kicking out, we don't really care, because we're still able to claim the benefit in the short term of being more likely to push the voice through, of ultimately making the Liberal Party appear more conservative, and that is a benefit because it pushes people who are moderate out of voting for Liberal. Finally, let's talk about voter allegiance, because as I pointed out in my introduction, this entire team's case is contingent on proving that people will vote for Liberals by hook or by crook. And I think there are a few reasons why people are ultimately under the status quo, flocking away from the Liberal Party and towards more moderate, and I think there are four. Firstly, it is unbelievably clear that this trend already exists through things like the Tilts being popular in New South Wales and Victoria, through things like the Greens being incredibly popular in Queensland. It is clear that this is the start of people being willing to vote for parties that aren't just Liberal or Labor. It is clear that that's the trend. Second of all, young people are having an increasing amount of power as they age into the voting bloc. That means that people who care about things like climate change and care about social issues that impact minorities are now able to vote, and that means that the Liberals are less likely to have power. Thirdly, people are becoming increasingly disenfranchised with the idea of a two-party system because they believe it's unrepresentative and because it's unpopular. As people become increasingly progressive and as education becomes more radical, people are likely to understand the problems with the two-party system. That is the reason why people are so anti-US politics in Australia. But finally, because the Liberal Party is captured by corporate donors, places like BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, big mining companies, their reliance on that funding means it's very difficult for them to shift their platform suddenly. They have to appease to the most conservative people because they're the ones that give them funding that their whole party is reliant on. That means that the Liberals Party's ability to become more progressive is limited versus Labor Party's ability to become more progressive than it already is much, much easier because the kind of people it gets its money from are much more willing to be flexible in the kind of things they believe in. But places like coal power stations are always going to care about being conservative because that's the only way they're ever able to make profit. So, what should you believe at the end of this speech? First of all, it is abundantly clear that people are willing to shift away from voting Liberal. Last election is only the start of it. It is untrue that the Liberal seats that still exist are the most conservative. Second of all, it is clear that these people walking is only going to be better for the voice, but the most important thing is that the nuance within the party that they describe, it is unclear what the actual benefit of that is. It is clear what people's stance is. Their ability to be productive within the Liberal Party is incredibly mitigated. Proud to affirm.
Panel, in 2013, there was a huge surge against Labor when Tony Abbott was elected. There was a lot of distrust in the Labor government for years of instability, there was the rise of independence, and there was the move away from people who had voted for Labor for decades of their life towards the Liberal Party. 10 years later, Labor now holds every single state and territory except Tasmania. It has overwhelming support in the federal, in federal politics. And the reason for that is it's extremely unlikely that a tidal wave of support against a major party in Australia is unlikely to knock it out from contention forever. Their claim that this is a long-term revolution against the Liberals is unrealistic. Australian politics is finicky. The Liberals are deeply entrenched in Australia for all the reasons they give you about Murdoch media support and the support of coal and gas giants. And for that reason, we think it's unrealistic for you to expect that this is the beginning of a tidal wave against the Liberals. This was a low point for Liberals. That didn't mean it was irrecoverable. We think they hinged their case on this analysis. We just think it's unrealistic for the reasons that we empirically and historically show you that it's false. I'm going to talk about two things. The first is the short-term impact of the freedom of speech or alleged freedom of speech of these politicians on the ways in which they vote about, or the ways in which people vote regarding the referendum. The first thing to observe here is that these politicians, when they're within the party, still have a degree of capacity to voice their opposition towards the voice. For the reason that A, people just empirically are currently doing this in the Liberal Party. Just because the party as a whole has taken a stance doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of internal factualism and disagreement. And secondly, for the reason that we know these people exist, for the reason that this debate is happening, and we can point to direct people in the Liberal Party who hold this perspective. Secondly, when we say that the counterfactual is them crossing the floor, that's not just in the moment of voting about whether or not the referendum should go in Parliament. That's also when it looks at that's also when the Liberals criticise the voice to Parliament in the media, that these politicians get up and disagree with this perspective. It's one less Liberal voice that is opposing the voice. That's incredibly important because it delegitimises the capacity of the Liberals to spread this view. But what do we tell you happens when you diverge from the Liberal Party? We tell you now you actually have far less legitimacy and people are far less likely to listen to you disagreeing. Why is that? Firstly, we think the Liberals have an incentive to stigmatise you and portray you as a traitor to the party. That means that the people who vote Liberal just because they support the Liberal Party are unlikely to listen to you because they see you as unaligned with their views, even if they were otherwise willing to accept your position when you were in the party. Notably, this is an extremely important distinction for our side, right? Because we think it's far more likely that you're likely to listen to somebody who supports the voice to Parliament if you're a Liberal when they're in the Liberal Party, for the reason that you don't see the Liberal Party as having an entrenched view. You're willing to consider their opinion. At the point at which they leave, they become a traitor to you. They become quite extreme. The Liberal Party attacks them and stigmatises them. All of the other politicians that you support who used to be their colleagues are now attacking them and vilifying them in particularly negative ways, far more than they would be if it was just an internal party disagreement. That is what is more likely to sway people's opinions. That is a unique distinction in this debate. And finally, Nicola tells you, unresponded, that this kind of media attention that you get for leaving the party is incredibly short-lived, right? Because at the point in which the media is no longer concerned about why you left, you now have to rely on your own funding and your own capacity to have your voice heard. The Liberals were always going to have that amount of entrenched funding and donor funding always, which meant that their narrative was always going to be the dominant one in the long term. So when they point to things like conservative policies that the Liberals will pass in the future, those were things that the Liberals had a far greater capacity to talk about, whereas you as a moderate independent had a far more diminished capacity. What does that mean? It means that the people who now leave the party have far less of a capacity to influence the ways people vote in the referendum than they would have if they were in the party. What this means is that, just like intuition check this, right? If you're a long-time Liberal voter and you're deciding whether or not you should vote yes or no regarding the voice to Parliament, if you're uncertain about what your party says, and if Liberal politicians who you respect are unsure, you're more likely to make your own judgment and you're far more likely to vote yes. Compare that to the party that you support having a very, very hardline response. Everyone who disagrees being completely stigmatised and having like smear campaigns against them. We think it's far more likely that Liberal supporters under our side will vote in support of the voice to Parliament. That was a unique and important short-term benefit that we get that they don't claim under their side. That was debate winning in and of itself. But now on the second clash of what happens long-term and how this changes the Liberal Party and whether or not it becomes smaller. Firstly, in order to believe all of their material, you have to believe that this makes the Liberal Party significantly smaller, right? That it guts them in a particularly meaningful way. We explained to you quite clearly, I think under-responded to, that most Liberal politicians actually just don't have an incentive to leave the party, and that the vast majority of them are fence-sitters on the voice to Parliament, as opposed to like active supporters if they disagree with the party line. What that means is all of these people who are fence-sitters about whether or not they should publicly support the voice to Parliament now turn to opposing it because they don't want to leave their party. Notably, they have a variety of clear incentives to do this, right? Not only do they have a clear career incentive to do this, not only do they get more funding as a part of the Liberal Party, not only do they retain their existing voter support, they just have a revealed preference to be a member of the Liberal Party for the reason that they currently are. We tell you that what that means is the amount of people who are likely to flip are likely to be low. And notably, once one or two people go and they get like completely down to the media and the Liberal Party and all their ex-colleagues come for them, there's a huge disincentive for people to then follow onto that path. We tell you, compare that to within the party having disagreements. People are far more likely to jump onto and bandwagon on factional disagreements because they still retain their power, they still retain their career and their position. That was incredibly important. That meant you actually got far more freedom of speech and far more discourse under our side than you did under theirs. But we tell you secondly, even if the Liberal Party becomes somewhat smaller, they still retain a huge amount of power, which is to say, even if there's a huge rise of teal independence, even if there's a huge move against the Liberal Party, the fact that they just have so much influence in the media, in the Murdoch media particularly, the fact that they have such a long history of legitimacy in Australia, the fact that they were literally in government a mere few years ago, means that people still care about the things that they have to say, even if they disagree with them, which means that their conservative views get a huge amount of airtime. They say, well, this doesn't really matter because now they've become a small, isolated party. Panel, it matters a lot if you have an extremely conservative party in Parliament that is voicing toxic views. I think it's really bad, for example, that Pauline Hanson, who has next to no voters and next to no support, does super controversial, insulting and insensitive things in Parliament. I think that harms people on the ground. I think that results in the rise of things like hate speech. That's incredibly bad, right? The fact that that is their best case scenario in this debate is quite bad for this opposition. For the reason that we tell you, A, the Liberal parties don't become isolated in the ways that they claim they will be, and secondly, even an isolated Liberal party still has a huge amount of sway in rhetoric, and that's particularly bad. But we tell you that people will still vote Liberal under our side, even if the party is more conservative. Why is that? Firstly, we tell you that the party doesn't become more conservative overnight, right? Like, it's unclear to us why the party was necessarily going to become more conservative in the first place. Maybe you have more conservative views on some issues, but that doesn't necessarily mean you switch to being super tough on crime. It was unclear why, we think it was under-mechanized from them, why specifically the Liberal Party becomes significantly more conservative. But we tell you, secondly, the Liberal Party isn't stupid. They know if they're losing voters, they need to switch their rhetoric and to switch their policy positions, which means that in campaigning, they're likely to decenter the super conservative platforms that they have and push the more moderate ones, which means that they gain all of the moderate voters, can still implement all of the conservative policy, and still maintain the basis of their support. That's incredibly devastating to this opposition, because it means that not only do Liberal Party voters who would have voted for the Liberals anyway now voted, but they now appeal to more moderate voters, even if they're not necessarily going to implement those policies, which means that the Liberal Party still has, in effect, the same amount of reach. And we tell you finally, the idea that there is a huge swing against Liberals because of young people and because of things like climate is incredibly strange for this opposition. Firstly, we tell you that there is just a lot of support, unfortunately, amongst young people for the Liberals. We tell you that the young Libs are particularly strong. But we tell you, secondly, that people broadly do support a two-party system for the reason that when the Labour Party does something controversial, when there's a scandal in the Labour Party, people are unlikely to then turn to the Greens and Independents because they want stability. So they're more likely to vote for a major party who they think can actually form government. And what that meant was that the two-party system was so entrenched that it was likely that people were going to vote Liberal anyway. So what you know at the end of this speech is not only do Liberal politicians have a greater capacity to oppose the Voice when they're within the party and to therefore affect people's votes on the Voice, but secondly, the Liberal Party was never going to be gutted in the ways in which they claimed they were. And even if they did suffer some harm, they were likely to be able to recover that and continue in the future. So proud to oppose.
This is going to be a fairly straightforward reply, focusing on why the win conditions of the affirmative team don't hold up. The first, win condition that they have is that the Liberal Party is going to lose a large amount of support, and that is a good thing. It means less conservative policy in the future. So obviously that is premised on both the Liberal Party losing a large amount of support, and secondly on them not having any sort of parliamentary presence in the future being a good thing. Issues with this. The first is that it is unclear that they actually do lose the amount of support that the affirmative team suggest. And I think that has been pretty clearly refuted down the bench. We tell you things like the fact that people do just have a deep allegiance to and commitment to the Liberal Party. They tell us that there's a shift. They tell us at Bella that there's a shift in the way that this is perceived, that people are now becoming more progressive. But it's firstly unclear that that this shift is true of all Liberal voters. I think there are still a lot of people who do vote Liberal who aren't particularly progressive, who aren't young people, who do make up a majority. And secondly, it's unclear that insofar as there is a shift, that shift is permanent. They did, the mechanization that they had was all just telling you to look around. But we tell you at Neva that the pendulum just oscillates back the other way, right? Unclear that this deep allegiance doesn't exist or that it will not exist in the near future. The next thing to note is that they neglect to, the next reason why the Liberal Party still has broad support is that unfortunately there are just a lot of conservative people in Australia. We tell you that down the bench. There are people who probably just do not like the voice to Parliament, which means that the Liberal Party aren't going to lose all of their currency in any event. They're also quite likely to retain quite a lot of it. And thirdly though, we say that even if they do lose some voters, they still retain a large degree of power because of the reasons that we point to you at second and at third. Things like the media that the Liberal Party has a lot of sway over, the discourse that the Liberal Party have a large power or presence in, the parliamentary debates that they are just inherently a part of. Obviously, there is still a large degree of support and power that the Liberal Party has, so therefore this idea that they lose that currency when members of their party leave or turn independent is fallacious. So, two consequences of this. Firstly, the Liberal Party is still supported more broadly, and that is a bad thing because it translates to more opposition to the Voice, which we, I think, all agree is a bad thing, or that opposition is a bad thing. But secondly, the people who support the Liberal Party become more conservative broadly. And this is something that the affirmative team agrees with. But the harm, or the benefit that they want to claim is that this isolates a Liberal voter base. But I think that they misunderstand the way that, turning a party conservative works. does not mean, as we have consistently told you, that people all of a sudden come out and are entirely conservative. It means that policy shifts more conservatively. I told you in my speech at first, this looks like the rhetoric around the voice to Parliament becoming slightly more racist, becoming slightly more conservative, in such a way that it is an insidious shift that influences the way that people vote. Obviously, if people are still willing to vote Liberal, are still allied to that party, they are likely to vote more conservatively. That is massively harmful. It guts their team of their benefits. It means that the voice is less likely to succeed. It means that in general, politics in Australia is more conservative. That is an incredibly bad thing. I guess the second reason why I think their team cannot win is that they neglect the value of things like nuance in our discussion of the voice. There is value to both literal and metaphoric floor crossing, in that it is important that we do have a voice that represents the way that the Australian public thinks, that both sides of the political spectrum think. Having a moderate right is a good thing. That is something that they neglect in their team. It is something that we prove down the bench to you is possible and important when you capture a degree or a diversity of views within the Liberal Party. It was much better to have a more representative Liberal Party, a more representative voice. So proud to negate.
Having a more representative Liberal Party in theory might be a good thing, but it's not as good as what we explained to you, which is that we get both a more representative Parliament generally, and that the individual politicians who are part of this debate are far better able to represent their communities when they are not attached to the Liberal brand and are not attached to Liberal careerist political incentives anymore. We give you a very simple claim that this team does not ever respond to beyond straw manning, and that is that people who leave the party because of this issue are likely to retain their seats. We give you 4 reasons why that is true: that they already have a strong name brand, that this increases that name brand, in fact, when they remain true to their principles and represent their individual constituencies more. Like, obviously, the voters in Bridget Archer's electorate were generally pro-voice and very different to the voters in somebody like Matt Canavan's electorate. The second thing that we explained to you is that this means that you're able to therefore be more representative of that moderate policy because you are not attached to and are perceived to be more representative of it, which means that you get elected as well. The third thing that we explained is you're now free of the branding of being a Liberal and therefore somebody who is bound to support assholes like Canavan and Dutton and conservative policies, which is appealing to your base. And we explained to you at Bella's speech very clearly that there are demographic shifts that mean that that particular brand of moderacy is likely to be extremely powerful. What does that mean for us? It means that Liberal governments of the future are unlikely to achieve majorities. And that's not based on us proving a huge swing against the Liberals. It's based on us proving that the people who leave the party, 3 to 5 of them, or 5 to 10, or whatever, that is enough to mean that you just can't achieve a majority. And we tell you in our first speech that majorities in Australia are historically extremely small, 1 to 2. This is more than enough to lock them out of forming a majority government, which explains why this move would attract large media attention, because it is significant and gives these people more of a platform to advocate for the voice in the short term. And it also explains why it gives them large quantities of power that they otherwise would not have to negotiate with future Liberal governments as part of the crossbench as well. All of that means then that at the end of this, we give people who are saying the right thing more of a platform, and we disempower a Conservative party and force it to actually concede more if it ever forms government in future, because it would be a minority government that would have to negotiate with these crossbenchers instead of just negotiating with them and as being part of the party. At the end of this, compare that against what they suggest to you. They suggest to you perhaps you can change people from within the Liberal Party. They do not respond to the fact that the campaign is over, that it did take a long time, and there was intense discussion. And guess what? The vote came in, and those moderates, after trying their hardest to convince the party to support the voice, failed. There is not going to be a second vote in the Liberal Party. It is too late to do that. Your only scope to advocate effectively is to leave the party, to throw away the brand, and to strike out on your own and weaponize the large short-term platform that you do get through that action to actually put that view forward and to represent your constituents who probably care far more about you as an individual MP who has been part of their community for a long time than they do about being a Liberal or whatever. So let's talk about whether it is good or bad that the Liberals are now more conservative. We tell you that being more conservative makes you far less likely to be electable. And what we explained, and the only response that they get is oh, but if you're a Liberal voter, you must be crazy, because otherwise you would have voted for your Teal. I don't know, it's great that you guys live in Sydney, but Teals didn't run in every seat. There wasn't a Teal candidate in Archer's seat, for instance. This is just wrong. The second thing to suggest, though, the moderate Liberals who remain in the party right now are ones who did not have a Teal challenger, definitionally. That is just true. And that means that these moderate Liberals, if they struck out on their own, are highly likely to be successful for the same reason that the Teals were successful, because that brand of politics is popular in areas that moderates are able to win. People who vote for moderates are moderates, simple observation, and like moderate policy. They don't like the Liberal brand, especially when it is already more conservative for the structural reasons that we give you. Which means then that striking out on your own means that these moderates are more likely to be elected, they're more likely to be even more moderate in their policy because they're no longer subject to things like being bought out by BHP or Rio Tinto, which we tell you at the bench, which means we get more moderate policy and fewer hardcore Liberals. Good thing for policy generally. And of course, we explained that this means you're more likely to get the voice as well. People probably trust you more when you're not associated with the Liberal brand in these specific electorates, and you get a large short-term platform, which allows you to do more advocacy that is different and distinct to what they give you, and you're not subject to fears about being purged from the party or getting your funding cut when you do so on our side, because you've already just made the call to strike out on your own and do what you believe in. So, more advocacy for the voice, better policy, better representation, 3 distinct paths to victory for us.